Welcome to the first lecture of Unit 4, the Global Ocean. This lecture will cover material in Chapter 13, the ocean floor. Subsequent chapters will include information about ocean water and ocean life and processes, the physical and chemical processes that drive ocean circulation. So Chapter 4, or Chapter 13, the ocean floor, discusses or covers information related to the ocean basins themselves. That is the geologic framework that underlie and underpin much of what happens in the ocean environment or the hydrosphere. Oceanography is a science that integrates lots of different earth sciences. There's physical geologists, chemical geologists, biological oceanographers, physical oceanographers, chemists, all are interested and have research that involves the ocean, and primarily because 71% of the Earth's surface is covered in water. The Earth is known in some circles as the blue planet. In fact, it is really a water-bound planet. Most biomass occurs in the oceans. Most superficial area is covered in water. So it's fitting that an earth science course deals with the oceans as a significant component. This view of the globe is different than what most folks think of when they think of the Earth. This view clearly is not what you typically see on a map. These two views shown here are shown from the perspective or viewpoint from above the North Pole and above the South Pole. Typical maps are oftentimes viewed from the side on the equator. That's kind of an arbitrary view any way you look at it. But what this really illustrates, this shot, is that really, in fact, when you look at the northern hemisphere is dominated. That's iffy. Certainly, there's a significant portion of the northern hemisphere that is covered in land or continental exposure. Terrestrial ecosystems, terrestrial environments exist with a fairly large proportion of water. The the Arctic Ocean and the Pacific here, and the northern Atlantic here. When you look at the globe from the South Pole, you see that, wow, there is a lot of water in the southern hemisphere. In fact, there's very little land mass. Tips of South America, Australia, and Africa do exist in the southern hemisphere, but it's entirely easy to understand that the dominant environment in the southern hemisphere is in fact water. There are four main ocean basins. This plot down here is another way of looking at it from a hemispheric perspective. Four main ocean basins on the Earth: the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, and the Arctic Ocean. The Southern Ocean, some scientists view it as a separate system, and if I go back here, it's because ocean circulation patterns actually rotate around, and it has a fairly unique set of physical and chemical characteristics. So some scientists do view the Southern Ocean as a specific entity. Other scientists actually treat the oceans as one whole mass. So you can view the ocean system as one entire interconnected body of water, or depending on the needs of the scientific inquiry, one can compartmentalize it into portions: Pacific, Atlantic, Arctic, Indian. You can even compartmentalize it into subsystems in the Pacific: the Northern Pacific, the Equatorial Pacific, and here in the Southern Pacific, or the Equatorial Atlantic, the North Atlantic, or the Southern Atlantic, and so forth. This plot over on the left shows how the relative proportion of area that these oceans encompass or cover. You can see that in the mid-latitudes, that is near the equator, and 0 latitude, the dominant area on the Earth is covered in the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Ocean water. You can see that further south at 60 degrees, there's absolutely very little land. But in between 30 and 60 degrees north, land areas actually dominate over relative percentages of ocean. Again, this is just another way of viewing that oceans cover up a majority of the Earth's surface. Oceanography itself is a relatively new science. Humans have been entranced and enthralled and curious about the oceans, and sometimes afraid of the oceans for long periods of time. We've all heard of the stories of early European explorers worrying that the ocean ended and dragons existed off the edges. The Chinese were some of the earliest seagoing peoples to cover large distances in open oceans. But peoples have been exploring the oceans for as long as information is recorded, that's for sure. But one of the first real oceanographic expeditions, so to speak, was the HMS Challenger expedition that left England in 1872, returned in 1876. And what it mainly did, and is the course that it charted is over here. What it mainly did was make bathymetric measurements. That is, measured what are called soundings, measure the depth of the ocean at a particular place in time. So this ship would essentially travel. It would stop. It would drop a line with a weighted stone on the bottom, and it would with marks on the line. It would lower it down until it hit the bottom, and the scientists on board or the workers on board would count the length or measure the length of line that was released until the weight hit the bottom. Now you can imagine how that could produce some inaccuracies if you have bending in the rope, if the ship up on the surface is drifting, so on and so forth. But what they did do is they created some of the first bathymetric maps of the ocean system, and they also did a lot of collections of water samples and biological specimens around the globe. It is credited with being the first kind of successful and comprehensive oceanographic research cruise ever. One of the main ways in which we can measure and characterize the ocean basin, that is the ocean floor, the geologic context for the ocean, is by, in modern techniques, using techniques of essentially called remote sensing. That is, using measurements, indirect measurements of the distance from the ocean surface to the seafloor. An early technique was used since the 1920s called sonar. It really took off, or was in wide use in the 1940s and 1950s during the Cold War, because there are a lot of military and strategic reasons for understanding the shape and structure of the ocean basins. Multi-beam sonar is a more modern technique where an array of sound sources and recorders are able to obtain or map or draw basically a picture, a three-dimensional picture of the ocean floor in kind of a narrow strip fashion. Whereas echo sounding is a single point. The ship emits a sound signal which will travel through the water and bounce, reflect back when it hits the bottom. And the travel time, which is dependent on things such as water density and water temperature, but as long as those two parameters are known, the travel time is indicative of the distance that it traveled. Multi-beam sonar is just basically a fancy, more complex version of single-point sonar. And then remote sensing is a technique that satellites can use to actually measure small perturbations in the surface of the surface ocean, that is in the shape of the surface ocean, and those reflect deeper ocean floor structure. So there's several different ways of characterizing and mapping and generating an image of what the seafloor looks like. Now, there are certain areas of the globe that are relatively poorly mapped. Recently, with the Malaysian airliner that was lost in the spring of 2014, that kind of disappeared over the Southern Ocean, South Indian Ocean, those areas are actually very, very poorly mapped, which complicated the recovery effort. Bathymetry or bathymetric maps are just like topographic maps that are used to characterize terrestrial systems. Bathymetric maps are relief maps that use topographic lines or bathymetric lines to travel or to delineate areas of equal altitude or depth. Depth in the context of bathymetry, altitude in the context of terrestrial environments. And this is an example of a shaded relief or bathymetric map of the continental slope and shelf off of the south coast of California. You can see different structures we'll examine in a little bit, but you can see the continental shelf areas, which are relatively low not very deep areas that are really extensions of the continents. We already kind of discussed this, and then we transitioned down into some features into the deeper ocean. Satellite altimetry, which I mentioned earlier, this slide is slightly out of order, is just the use of satellites to look for anomalies or slight perturbations in the surface structure of ocean water as it reflects ocean basin topography or geomorphology. Another way of knowing or characterizing the ocean basin is to actually figure out what lies below the seafloor. That is, how do we know what lies below? Characterizing the ocean basin, that is the surface of the ocean basin, is one thing, and there's lots of interesting information that comes from that. But some other interesting information comes from both the sedimentary and the metamorphic and igneous layers that exist down below the surface of the ocean floor. Layers of sediment accumulate over time. Oceanic crust, whether it's primary igneous or has been metamorphosed over time, can often provide insights into deep earth processes, plate tectonics, and what's called paleoclimatology or paleoceanography. The sediments will record the history of the ocean in those places as sediments are continuously accumulated. Information, chemical and structural information embedded in those layers reflect the conditions that existed when those layers were deposited. Seismic profiling is a way of mapping and basically diagramming or determining what the subsurface structure is like. Seismic profiling uses a large sound source. It's essentially generating not really an earthquake, but you're capitalizing on some of the similar characteristics of how compressional waves travel through different materials at different rates. And if you can generate an energy pulse, usually with some sort of explosion or loud concussive process, either in the middle of the ocean depths or from a ship itself, and a ship towing a receiver or basically a recorder that will essentially similar to a seismometer that will record that energy returning as it's reflected back up. You can see that these different compressional waves, some will hit a layer and then bounce up. Others will not only hit, but they will travel through, and when they hit other layers, they will either refract or reflect. Those refraction and reflection patterns, as measured by the recorder, the receiver, can be used from fairly complex kind of computational algorithms to determine underlying structure. Up here we have an actual seismic profile of a layer of sedimentary and igneous subsurface structure. The major large-scale ocean basin morphology is fairly consistent in different places around the world. There are three major topographic units on the ocean floor, or geomorphological units. There's the continental margins, that is where the ocean basins intersect the continents. There's the ocean basin floor, and then there are features called mid-ocean ridges. If you look at a cross-section this is a representative cross-section from the north coast of North America, it looks like somewhere up near Maine, to the northwest coast of Africa, A to B. If we looked at that in three-dimensional cross-section, we can see the edge of the continent at A. Continental margin is the transition from continental to oceanic crust. The deep ocean basin is usually some of the deepest parts of the ocean, although there are deeper parts, and we'll learn about those in a minute. And then in the middle of many oceans is something called a mid-ocean ridge. Now, we'll again look at mid-ocean ridges in detail. They don't always have to be in the exact middle or near the middle, but they're usually between, or at least between, a deep ocean basin and a continental margin, at least on one side. Continental margins can be characterized in two different ways: passive continental margins or active continental margins. And the characterization is based on the tectonic environment, how active tectonics are in that region. Now, passive continental margins are typical. The Atlantic Ocean basin is a representative of a passive continental margin. It's far from ocean or from plate tectonic boundaries. The plate tectonic boundaries in the Atlantic Ocean are in the middle, and Europe and Africa on one side, North America and South America on the other, where these continental margins are very far removed from the centers of tectonic activity. Volcanism and earthquakes are rare in passive tectonic or passive continental margins, which is essentially kind of what it says. They're very passive. Continental or passive continental margins are characterized by three major structural features. First, starting from continental side, the first is the continental shelf, which is usually comprised of thick, shallow water sediments. It's coastal environments, and it's a transition zone between the continent and the ocean system. Shallow waters, lots of accumulation of sediment. We transition into what's called the continental slope, which is the seaward edge of the continental shelf. It's a relatively steep structure, and it is the boundary between continental and continental crust and oceanic crust. The continental rise is where the continental slope is transitioning into the deep ocean basin. Trenches are absent, trenches that would occur at active continental margins at subduction zones. So the rise occurs where trenches are absent, it merges with the slope, and you also have thick layers of sediment. The base of continental rises are often characterized by deep sea fans, which are kind of deltaic or lobular formations deposited by turbidites, which are large kind of underwater mass wasting events. Submarine canyons and turbidite currents characterize the slope. These are deep, steep-sided valleys that are cut into continental slopes. Some are seaward extensions of river valleys, so where you have large rivers transmitting a large amount of bed load and suspended load. The submarine canyons often coincide. Most submarine canyons appear to have been eroded by turbidity currents, which are when large amounts of material will suddenly and relatively quickly translate or move downslope toward the continental rise and deep sea fans. Turbidite sequences are often quite characteristic in terms of their lithology. Active continental margins, on the other hand, are characterized by active tectonic processes. They are typical of around the Pacific Ocean, which is, as we remember from earlier chapters, known as the Ring of Fire, where there's lots of subduction zones. They're characterized by deep ocean trenches. They're trenches are relatively long and narrow features. They are the deepest parts of the ocean. The abyssal plains or the deep ocean basins are deep, but not as deep as the trenches, where you have usually an oceanic plate subducting beneath another oceanic plate or a continental plate, dragging down lots of material, creating big depressions in the Earth's crust. Most active continental margins are in the Pacific Ocean. Deep ocean trenches occur where moving lithospheric plates plunge down into the mantle or subduct. The force or the reason that you have subduction is usually based on density. Oceanic crust, as remember, is comprised mostly of basaltic rocks and minerals, higher density than typical continental andesitic or granitic crust. Accumulations of deformed sediments and scraps of ocean crust can form accretionary wedges that get scraped off the bottom and eventually can be uplifted into accretion zones. Often volcanic activity is associated with the subduction zones and active continental margins. Island arc systems, continental arc systems predominate. Some subduction zones have little or no accumulation of sediments. That is, they're moving so fast, or erosional processes that moving material off the coast aren't operating at fast enough rates for accumulation of sediments to occur. The abyssal plains, on the other hand, are the second of the three primary zones of ocean basin geometry. The first being margins. We looked at passive and active margins just a second ago. Abyssal plains are the deep ocean basins. Abyssal plains are very flat, relatively tectonically quiet zones of sediment accumulation. Because sediment is accumulating in kind of low energy, long time scale environments, they're very, very level. There's very little deformation. There's very little erosion. There's very little of the processes that would otherwise change the shape and nature of these deposits. They're very, very flat. They're thick accumulations of sediments characterize these zones, and they're found in all oceans. Interspersed in these abyssal plains are seamounts and guyots, which are basically isolated volcanic peaks, sometimes in hot spots, otherwise sometimes near oceanic ridges, where volcanism, relatively isolated volcanism, will produce underwater volcanoes, underwater mountains, which are called seamounts, and guyots, which are eroded, flat-topped seamounts. You can see in this map, there's lots of different, in these abyssal plains, lots of plateaus and large kind of elevated platforms that are produced by these processes. So seamounts and guyots and atolls are all part of the same type of system, where oceanic crust is perforated by rising mantle plumes, and either volcanic islands can form if the volcanism extrudes above the surface, or seamounts that are below the surface can exist. Two modes of origin for these systems. One is near oceanic ridges where volcanism is taking place along the transform boundaries. Others are in mid-plate where mantle plumes hotspots exist, such as the Hawaiian Emperor chain, where a stationary rising mantle plume creates a line or chain of islands over long periods of geologic time. The third area of ocean basin geometry that we'll talk about are the mid-ocean ridges. The mid-ocean ridge system is actually an interconnected system of divergent plate boundaries. It's the longest topographic feature on the Earth's surface. They're not always in the middle of the ocean. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge clearly is right in the middle, but ridges such as the East Pacific Rise really don't bisect the Pacific Ocean. They're kind of biased, or it's significantly biased toward the eastern portion of the basin. So mid-ocean ridge is a little bit of a misnamed or unfortunate nomenclature. However, as long as you remember that they happen in the middle of ocean basins, not exactly the geographic middle, but in the midst, between abyssal plains, you'll be fine. They're divergent boundaries. They're about 2 to 3 kilometers in elevation above the abyssal plain. These are significantly high, relatively high topographic features in the ocean basins. And they are over, the whole ridge system is 70,000 kilometers in length. But what's really interesting about mid-ocean ridges is, and when you see them on a map like this, you tend to see this kind of line, and you know that, well, that's where the plates are spreading apart. A new basaltic crust is being formed there, and they look like they're very kind of fine, very discrete systems where there's not much, they don't encompass a lot of area. Well, actually, they spread quite wide. These lines on this map really just generate or are mapping the spreading center, or the actual plate boundary, whereas the features themselves are 1,000 to 4,000 kilometers wide. They actually comprise almost 1/4 of the Earth's surface. They are massive features. And the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, probably because it's in between North America and Europe, where a lot of science has been done, and the North Atlantic was a really important strategic zone in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union up until the late 80s, late 1980s, sorry. The North Atlantic is the most studied ridge system of any of them on Earth. Mid-ocean ridges are where asthenosphere is rising. It's the locations of new crust generation, and the oceanic crust is split apart as new asthenosphere rises in the middle, creates new new oceanic crust. Rifting occurs, and that is one half of the driving force of plate tectonic motion. The other half being subduction, which has a tensional effect. Along mid-ocean ridges, there's extensive faulting and many volcanic structures. It's a really dynamic and tectonically and volcanically active place. Along the axis of some segments are structures, normal faulted structures that are rift valleys, characterized by horsts and grabens typically. And they are typically characterized by layers and layers of basaltic rocks that have been faulted and uplifted. Remember, it's the site of formation of new oceanic crust. The ocean floor in between the mid-ocean ridges and the continental margins, we mentioned earlier in the abyssal plains and the ocean basin, is mantled or covered with sediment from many different sources. The dominant sources of sediment are terrestrial, that is sediment that's being washed out from land, but there are also marine sources of sediments. Turbidity currents are these currents that incise continental slopes, transporting material from the slopes and the shelves down to the deep ocean. Sediment slowly settles to the bottom from above if it's authigenic or sediment or material that's formed in place. Sediment that you find in the ocean basins is typically thickest in the trenches. Accumulations can approach 10 kilometers. In the Pacific Ocean, which is a relatively younger ocean, 600 meters of sediment or less typical. Atlantic Ocean, 500 to 1,000 meters thick. And moving away from the mid-ocean ridge systems, which the mid-ocean ridge systems, youngest crust is closer to the mid-ocean ridge and older crust is further away. The further away you go from the mid-ridge center, the ridge axis, the longer sediment has had to accumulate and the thicker it usually is. Mud, which is a sedimentological characterization of particles that are typically, or that are 62 microns. A micron is 1/1000th of a millimeter. So 62 microns or finer. It's the most common sediment in the deep ocean floor. And sediments are sampled by scientists by deep sea coring. This is a way of sending a device down to the ocean floor, basically an empty tube. It slams into the bottom, hopefully without disturbing the layers very much. There's usually mechanical devices that trap the core in the tube, and then you can pull the tube back up to the surface where the sediment that was incorporated into the tube comes back to the surface and can be extruded on a long bench and studied and researched by scientists. It's a fascinating pursuit. Scientists spend a lot of money and time obtaining cores from the deep ocean basin. The deep ocean basin is a great place to look for information and clues about what has happened on the Earth over geologic time. So the different kinds of sediments that occur in the ocean floor, or that you'd find in the ocean basins, fall into four main categories. The dominant categories are terrigenous and biogenic or biogenous. Terrigenous sediments come from where it says come from land or the terrestrial system. The source is erosion of land, volcanic eruptions which can produce ash that will fall into the oceans and blown dust. Erosion of land through either stream flow or glaciation can contribute terrestrial sediments to the ocean system. Quartz is a common material that comes off the continents, clays and mud. And the distribution is they're dominant on continental margins, that is closer to their sources. They are also dominant in abyssal plains and polar ocean floors. They make up cover about 45% of the ocean basin. Biogenic sediments, which are organic accumulation of hard parts of some marine organisms, that is, marine organisms that grow shells, that the shells are made of minerals that will last for a long, long time. When those organisms die, those pieces of shell will eventually sink to the bottom. And it may be surprising, but these microscopic organisms do result or generate enough material that it encompasses or covers about 55% of the ocean floor. They're dominant. These calcareous and siliceous oozes are dominant in the deeper and central parts of the oceans. Siliceous ooze dominates below about 5 kilometers in ocean depth, and that's due to an interesting curiosity in terms of or geochemical concept called the calcium carbonate compensation depth, the CCCD, where calcium carbonate is supersaturated, or ocean water is supersaturated with respect to calcium carbonate above depths of about 5,000 meters or 5 kilometers. But once you get down below, the saturation state changes, and actually calcium carbonate containing minerals will dissolve. So it's a nuance that's not critical for this course, but it is interesting nonetheless. And the other two fairly rare types of sediment, but they're worth mentioning, are hydrogenous sediments that are formed from within the water system. Proper term is, well, many scientists prefer the term authigenic, that is, they form in place from precipitation of dissolved minerals. They're not biogenic, that is, they're not mediated by biology, although sometimes bacteria can influence the saturation state of the environments in which these minerals precipitate. Manganese nodules and phosphorite deposits are examples. They're present, they're fairly ubiquitous, they're always present, but they're dominated by the other more common terrigenous and biogenic sediments. And then cosmogenic, which is dust from space, meteorite debris, tektite spheres, glassy nodules that arise or are deposited just like they are on land as these minerals or grains do penetrate the Earth's atmosphere and fall to Earth. It's a very, very, very small proportion. Here we have some examples of manganese nodules. These are really just magnesium oxide, and they are relatively hard. They're economically important. Manganese is an important ore or mineral, and so they are sought after. And then this is a highly magnified image of what's called a foraminifera, which is a type of planktonic microorganism, usually photosynthesizing, that generates a beautiful calcium carbonate shell or calcite limestone shell. There's thousands, if not tens of thousands, of different species of these foraminifera, and they have a wide variety of structures that they exhibit, wide variety of ecosystems that they inhabit: surface ocean, deep ocean, mid-ocean, polar, temperate, tropical. They're used by paleontologists and stratigraphers and micropaleontologists to do a lot of really interesting studies in the ocean about how the ocean has worked in the past. The distribution of sediments in the ocean system is shown by this figure right here. Coarse terrigenous deposits, which are the deposits coming from land, as you would expect, dominate in coastal areas. So this kind of light cream color. These areas are dominated by coastal, terrigenous deposits that arise from the land surface adjacent to where they're found. It makes a lot of sense. Fine-grained terrigenous material, which is going to stay suspended in water as it transmits off the coast a little bit longer than the coarse-grained stuff, will be more common in deeper zones of the ocean basin. Hydrogenous or authigenic sediments, only a really, really small percent. These H's where it kind of indicates hydrogenous sediments. They really are ubiquitous around the ocean, but there are areas due to ocean chemistry and physical processes that sometimes they occur in a little bit higher abundance than they normally would. There are a few places where very little sediment accumulates. The only places that really are these environments are where there's really rapid ocean currents that are otherwise scouring or moving or transporting, eroding sediments away, or the mid-ocean ridges where the crust is so young that sediment just hasn't had enough time to accumulate. And lastly, oozes, these biogenic deposits that are created from the dead remains of living organisms, or the remaining hard parts of formerly living organisms. Calcareous and siliceous oozes dominate far from continents. Now, as we come to a close in chapter 13, the ocean floor, we should mention that marine scientists and humanity in general is very interested in the ocean floor for a number of reasons. Curiosity is one, but in a lot of ways, what drives exploration is our need for resources. There are a lot of oil and gas resources in the ocean system. Gas hydrates are of particular interest and focus of research now. gas hydrates are methane hydride, which is a hydrated form of natural gas, or clathrates is another term for them. These are physical deposits. These are hard deposits of methane or natural gas that exist on the ocean floor in very, very cold and high pressure situations. That's why they're solid. If they were extractable, it would form a significant energy resource. The problem with methane hydrates is that they are incredibly unstable at surface temperatures, which are warmer, and surface pressures, which are much, much lower. Unstable insofar as this kind of thing, where they just burst into flame. They evaporate. They're very, very hard to handle. Very, very hard to extract. Other resources that come from the marine system: sand and gravel, evaporative salts, the salt that we use for table salt, and as well as other mineral for industrial processes, and manganese nodules, as mentioned before. So that's the end of chapter 13. I tried to be a little faster on this one. Hopefully I'll be quick and efficient on the next two. Thanks for taking the time to listen, and we'll see you in chapter 14.